There's a kind of honor among thieves, and a whole toolkit of shared skills that people pick up when stealing becomes their business. Because if you drift aimlessly through society's dark underbelly, sooner or later you end up as someone else's meal. But if you move with purpose, you can survive, and sometimes even thrive. Living in the shadows takes wit, sharp judgment, and a certain energy. You need strength when temptation shows up, patience when life gets ugly, and you need to keep moving because the fog closes in from every side. In Russian, there's a word for thief, vor. Being a vor in Russia is dangerous work, and if you want to be successful at it, you're not likely to get there alone. The life is risky either way, but inside the vorovskiy mir, the thieves' world, there's something like safety and something like brotherhood. And it's that brotherhood we're looking at here, the Bratva, the Russian Mafia. It was conceived under the Tsars in the 18th and 19th centuries. It endured through decade after decade of Soviet rule, and it kept going into a newer Russian state, where the line between vor and oligarch is often blurred. The Bratva and the underground network it built can rival the best and most dangerous criminal enterprises in the world. From the Tsars to the Soviets to Yeltsin and Putin, Russia's government was never really not authoritarian. The real question was always, how authoritarian? And woven into that authoritarian structure at almost every level, you find theft used as a tool for gaining wealth at someone else's expense. Nobles and aristocrats take from villages. Party bosses manage a one-way flow of resources inside the party. Every modern business has its oligarchy. Every judge and every policeman has a price. In a world like that, a thief who refuses to hide behind a respectable mask isn't strange because he steals, he's strange because he admits he steals. The Bratva's roots stretch back into the hard years of the 18th and 19th centuries, the same era that produced folk heroes like Vanka Kane. Back then, policing in Russia was close to non-existent. With a population of about 120 million people, Russia employed only around 48,000 police nationwide, about one officer for every 2,500 people. Most of those police were concentrated in big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Out in the countryside, around 90 million peasants were trying to scrape out a living with only about 8,000 law enforcement authorities scattered across a massive landscape. With few official ways to handle legal disputes, villagers relied on a kind of frontier justice, brutal, inventive, and often terrifyingly effective. In isolated communities with very few enforceable rules, acts like murder, arson, or even petty theft could be judged by the moral code of a lynch mob. Punishment wasn't just about the offender, it was also a warning meant for anyone else who might get the same idea later. And these local rules often had little to do with what aristocrats and landlords wanted. A landlord might prosecute a peasant for stealing firewood from an estate, but might not care much if one peasant killed another in a drunken argument. As a Russian peasant proverb puts it, God punishes sins, the state punishes crimes. But it's a mistake to think Russian society was only peasants on one side and aristocrats on the other. There was a third force to consider, Russia's bandit class. These groups had already organized into small bands with enough muscle to harass peasants in the wilderness and sometimes even take over villages. The worst of them were horse thieves, stealing some of the most valuable property a rural peasant owned, and often earning the harshest punishment when they were caught. Over decades, even centuries, the conflict between peasant and bandit escalated. Peasants learned to organize and resist. Bandits learned how to build stronger, more coordinated gangs that could do more than run small raids. Eventually, those gangs built protection rackets. Pay us, and we won't steal your horses. Over time, that grew into a criminal architecture with its own hierarchies, its own territories, foreign networks, and connections to corrupt police and horse dealers. But those horse thieves didn't simply evolve into the modern Bratva. World War I created huge demand for horses, and the societal reshaping that followed the Bolsheviks' rise caused many of those groups to fade away. The Bratva's roots instead came from peasants who had watched gangs operate in the countryside, then left home and tried to make it in the big city. For all their effort, many of them ended up in city slums where the vorovskiy, the thieves' world, first truly germinated.
These were filthy, poor, often violent neighborhoods, and the rules were different there. There was no community to defend, just a vast zero-sum game where you were basically invisible and where someone else often had to go hungry if you wanted to eat. The Tsars neglected these places, and the police usually avoided them because they knew better than to walk into the slums alone, or even with a small squad. With so little pressure on them, the thieves' world ran largely unchecked. Specialized gangs popped up: pickpocketing, burglary, kidnapping, intimidation, and worse. Gang bosses became local legends, and some of them began to seep into Russian civil society. Many figures who would become important later first learned the trade in that environment, Joseph Stalin among them, running an armed robbery and protection racket before the October Revolution. By the time of the revolution, the vorovskiy had hooks not just in the collapsing Tsarist aristocracy, but inside the Bolsheviks as well. Stalin was only one example. Many revolutionaries were vor, and many vor were revolutionaries, and others owed their success, or even their safety, to the underworld's conditional goodwill. Then, Russia took 3 brutal hits in a row in the late 1910s and early 1920s. First, the Great War, then the October Revolution, then the Russian Civil War. Countless individual criminals died, but the cynical, often savage survival structures of the slums were far better built for long-term survival than high-minded groups of Bolsheviks could ever hope to be.
What followed worked in 2 directions. Plenty of thugs and career criminals joined the Bolsheviks just to be on the winning side, improving their position for the simple price of endorsing Marxist ideals. And plenty of Bolsheviks found themselves forced to make nice with the thieves' world to win. The balance overwhelmingly favored the vorovskiy. It was rare for a Russian gangster to have even a fleeting interest in leaving the prosperity of criminal enterprise behind. It was common for a revolutionary to learn how to rationalize working with Russia's most unsavory characters. Organized crime grew stronger during the Bolsheviks' rise, but it was under one of their own, Joseph Stalin, that the thieves' world had to adapt in the most dramatic way. Stalin's Gulag system of labor camps reshaped Soviet society in a way the October Revolution never could, and the consequences were devastating for anyone swept up in it, including many vori. The camps affected the thieves' world in many ways. They were a business opportunity, a place to extend the black market and recruit from the inside. But more importantly, they became a cultural melting pot for criminals from all across Russia. Gangsters cross-pollinated their methods, traded values and ideas, and swapped the practical tricks of running the Soviet underbelly. A prison newspaper at the Gulag camp described the camp like a real school, offering a second stage of training for future skilled, stylish criminals. Elements of criminal morality were encouraged: what's right and wrong for a thief, and professional skills, thievery, fraud, forgery, and more, were taught and practiced. So when a vor eventually left the Gulag, he carried that training back into whatever city he ended up in. The gulags also produced one of the most defining roles in Bratva culture, the vorovskiy, the thief within the code. It's loosely comparable to the idea of a godfather and the Italian Mafia, but the match isn't perfect. A vorovskiy could be a gang leader or a particularly menacing criminal, but he didn't have to be. Often he was a respected, almost intellectual figure who could teach underlings and act as a judge or mediator among peers. He was both an example and an enforcer of the thieves' code, which hardened into a strict set of expectations that reinforced the hierarchy of the vorovskiy and the principle that honest thieves deal with honest thieves. That code could be ruthless. A vor might be free to shoot a party official in the head, but he could not neglect payment on a bet owed to another thief. Punishments were often corporal and brutal. A vor who got a gang tattoo he hadn't earned might be lucky if the only punishment was having the tattooed skin cut off his body.
Worse violations, like informing to the police, were almost certainly punished by death, and a victim was considered fortunate if he got to choose whether he was thrown off a cliff or had his throat cut. Inside the gulags, vor also imposed their will on other prisoners, petty crooks and political dissidents who hadn't belonged to the Soviet criminal underworld before they arrived. These people suffered brutally under the vor, who often forced them to meet labor quotas. After all, a central part of the thieves' code was that you do not waste your work contributing to the state under any circumstance. Those prisoners endured abuse, rape, theft, beatings, and exile to the coldest bunks or corners of the camps. Their reality was summed up in a line many vor would throw at them: "You die today, and I'll die tomorrow." World War II hit vor and non-vor alike and sent many to the front lines to be killed, but it didn't fundamentally disrupt the camp power structure. What created bigger pressure was the state's need to maintain totalitarian control after the war had killed tens of millions of Soviets, including many who had been most loyal to the state. With limited manpower, the line between guard and prisoner blurred. Many criminals joined forces with camp guards in exchange for even better treatment, explicit perks and benefits. Some became guards or administrators, or even commanded their gulag while still technically prisoners. They gained access to the outside world, tying camp operations into the Mafia's wider criminal enterprise. But doing that meant breaking the thieves' code by allying with the state. Those collaborators were labeled suki by traditionalists and effectively signed their own death warrants. Yet, as the number of suki grew, they protected one another and gained protection from the state. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the gulags were torn by the Suka Voina, the war between traditionalists and the collaborators inside the criminal class. The Soviet state likely had some role in the violence, but one way or another, the camps were at war with themselves for years. When Stalin died in 1953, the Gulag system was downsized dramatically. About 1 million former prisoners were released and scattered across the country, many returning to Bratva organizations in their home cities or wherever happened to be closest. Over the following 7 years, the Gulag population shrank by about 4/5, and the camps went from being the incubator of the thieves' world to a relatively minor place on its edge.
The camp-state collaborators, having won the prisoners' war, dispersed throughout the Soviet Union and carried a massive cultural shift into the Bratva. Now it was no longer necessary to operate completely independently from the state. If corrupt party members or local leaders felt like helping the thieves' world, that was simply good business. In many ways, the 1960s and 1970s were a dark age for the Bratva. Any mafia trying to operate inside the Soviet Union had to compete with the super mafia of the Communist Party, and they were hopelessly outmatched. The Suki used their party connections to carve out space for small-scale organizations in exchange for compliance and for ensuring that nothing major happened outside state control. An unexpected side effect followed. A new generation of Russian thugs, who might otherwise have been shaped by Bratva discipline, instead organized into unruly street gangs, settling conflicts with massive neighborhood brawls. Some of the more successful street gangs drifted into protection or burglary, but without the operational sophistication or survivability of their forebears. During these years, the remnants of the thieves' world slowly pushed their influence upward into Russian society, binding the black market more closely to the decaying Soviet state. Organized crime became the middleman between the state, the black markets, and ordinary people. Soviet Russia increasingly depended on corruption as a means of survival, and by becoming indispensable to civil society, the vor regained leverage they had lost after Stalin. That influence translated into tribute payments in exchange for overseeing the flow of goods into the hands of people who wanted them. Gangs started to feel a wider sense of unity again, with leaders meeting in congresses to debate big moves, whether to sell drugs, how to respond to changes in police organization, and so on. So when Mikhail Gorbachev arrived in the mid-1980s and tried to push sweeping reforms, the thieves' world was perfectly positioned to exploit the chaos he unintentionally created.
It's honestly striking how often Gorbachev's policies helped the vor. He campaigned against alcohol, which pushed demand into the black market. He encouraged semi-private business, giving criminals a mechanism to launder money. And in what looks like the ultimate gift, the Soviet Union collapsed at the exact moment the thieves' world was becoming richer than ever and was ready to enlist those earlier street gangs as muscle. By the time the final nails were hammered into the Soviet coffin, the vorovskiy mir had already planned how to divide power and territory across the many Russian republics. It prepared to take over industry, civil society, and any corner of illegitimate enterprise that remained untouched. And the man taking over, Boris Yeltsin, made clear through his actions that he wasn't particularly interested in standing in the Bratva's way. In many ways, the post-Soviet world was perfect for organized crime. Wealth inequality spiraled out of control, and huge parts of society were desperate to make ends meet however they could. The state had little manpower and even fewer resources, and much like officials under the Tsars, they knew better than to throw their weak weight around in mob-controlled areas. With limited and ineffective economic protections to stop them, many vor transitioned their illegal enterprises into legal or semi-legal ones. Others treated the era as pure economic anarchy, so much to gain and so little to lose, except lives that the thieves valued only minimally even in the best of times. Individual gangs went to war for territory and profit. These wars were often extremely violent, and the winners weren't decided only by who gathered the most firepower, but also by who could stop their own crews from turning inward and tearing themselves apart. The winners established dominion over their territory and lived almost unquestioned. But to collect the biggest possible share of revenue, they had to prove they could provide dependable protection and fair regulation, all while keeping a firm and cunning grip on their customers. Old principles became important again: the status of the honest thief, the ability to demonstrate strength through limited violence rather than endless war, and the discipline to treat crime like business. But crucial changes came with that. Now, a promise made to clients and partners outside the thieves' world had to carry just as much weight as a promise to another mobster. And in a world full of lesser criminals, a serious mob authority often had to stage shows of force to prove legitimacy, while still trying to avoid the kind of open violence that brings police attention. As mobsters got better at playing that game, violence began to subside and gave way to more business-like order. The unrestrained corruption and mob rule of the 1990s softened somewhat in the 2000s when Vladimir Putin rose to power. The thieves' world worried about a major crackdown. Some moved assets abroad and made preparations, but for the most part, those fears were misplaced.
Putin had his own connections to the underworld, and without saying it outright, he crafted an unofficial state policy. Mobsters who operated discreetly and kept the right officials greased were mostly left alone. Much like he did with Russia's oligarch class, Putin ensured the government could work smoothly with the people who truly held power and influence.
In this new environment, Bratva life changed. Their insular rituals and traditions were no longer necessary or even appropriate. Tattoos, especially visible ones, became outdated, and so did the old gang songs and Gulag-born slang. Someone who had served 5 or 10 prison sentences was no longer seen as a hardened leader. He was a liability when negotiating with legitimate business owners. The spiritual leaders of the past, the zakone, often saw their titles reused as vanity labels for influential gangsters, even when those gangsters had done nothing to earn them. The few traditionalists left resented the change, but even they had to accept the reality. The Bratva was no longer just a brotherhood of outcasts. It had become an immensely valuable enterprise, and it had to be treated that way. Today, the Bratva sits among other global underground networks: the Italian Mafia, the Japanese Yakuza, the Chinese Triads.
Yet in many ways, it's still its own thing. It has a broadly familiar structure, an inner circle, associates, outside contractors, hopeful newcomers, but it tends to function in a less strictly hierarchical way, spread across territories with limited overall coordination. And unlike groups that specialize tightly, a local Bratva organization often reaches across most sectors. It builds a network where gangsters can move laterally between industries or climb vertically inside structures of control and influence, trusting the people they're working with. The initiation rituals that teach you who to trust are often murky or group-specific, but the broader principle holds. Thieves' honor still matters. Mutual profitability, even between gangs sharing the same city, is far more valuable than triggering the kind of scrutiny that car bombs or snipers would bring. Some groups have outsized influence inside Russia. The Chechen Mafia, for example, is described as fiercely loyal to its own ranks and highly skilled at unleashing violence on enemies. It has long been tied closely to Chechen authorities, including its first president, who oversaw a particularly corrupt period in Chechen history. Even outside their region, their style of protection operates almost like a franchise, a reputation for honesty, loyalty, and unbelievable violence against enemies. Many Russian gangs pay a cut of their proceeds to the nearest Chechen gangster in order to borrow that reputation. And then there's Russia's ruling class, made up of a small but tremendously influential group of oligarchs, known for a long list of shady business dealings and mob connections. In 2022, the US-based think tank Atlantic Council estimated that Russia's oligarchs controlled about $250 billion in what's referred to as dark money, made from a mix of theft from the Russian state budget, extortion of private businesses, and seizure of profitable enterprises. Across all of these ventures, the Bratva's role is hard to miss. Oligarchs appear as modern sponsors of the Bratva, taking only a portion of what mobsters collect, yet even that portion suggests enormous scale. That oligarch presence also hints at how global the Bratva has become. In some countries, it dominates the underground underworld. Elsewhere, it acts as a facilitator, lending expertise and connections. Like in Russia itself, Bratva groups keep a broad portfolio, diversifying across criminal enterprises and into legitimate and semi-legitimate businesses as well. They've also been more than willing to feed off Russia's annexation of Crimea and the low-grade war in the Donbass region of Ukraine, expanding their influence and building thriving black markets there. Looking forward, it's hard to say exactly what will happen within the Bratva. Their grip inside Russian society makes it unlikely they'll give up control anytime soon. And with Russia increasingly becoming a kind of para-state during its invasion of Ukraine, there's concern the black market could be rushing toward a new golden age, one that could make the 1990s look tame. More immediately, the war has raised fears of a reshuffle at the top of Russia's underworld. In late 2022, the Bratva boss, Krisha Mazkovsky, warned that Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov and Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin might be positioning for conflict, either with Vladimir Putin, with each other, or both, and that a battle like that would have consequences across the Russian criminal sphere. And when you look at Russia today, it can feel impossible to tell where the state ends and where the Bratva begins. But the deeper point is that this might be the wrong way to think about it. After so many years of adaptation, and with ties between government and organized crime growing deeper, it makes more sense to see Russian society as a continuum. Very rarely is any enterprise 100% legitimate. Very rarely does a person have absolutely no connections, direct or second or third degree, to organized crime. And very rarely does a criminal enterprise exist completely untethered from the Russian state. As often happens, reality lives somewhere in the middle, built on the backs of honest thieves who today shape a Russia that is, in a very real sense, their own.